Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 254 of the Medieval Podcast. I'm Danièle Sobalski, also known as the 5-Minute Medievalist. This weekend, my kids came back from a trip to Italy, a place where I've never been. And just like medieval travelers, they brought me back some thoughtful souvenirs. A pen from the Vatican, a volcanic rock from Pompeii, and some Venetian glass from Murano. Summer is the perfect time to take these voyages of discovery, for learning more about yourself and other people's way of life, and for making personal connections with the past. So as we wrap up another season of holiday travel, let's take a look at medieval voyages, what they were like, and how we know about them. This week, I spoke with Dr. Anthony Bale about what it was like to travel in the Middle Ages. Anthony is a professor of medieval studies and the former executive dean of the School of Arts at Birkbeck, University of London. He's an award-winning teacher, researcher, and author who has edited and translated the works of John Mandeville and Marjorie Kemp, as well as publishing on everything from pilgrimage to medieval anti-Semitism to the Crusades. His new book is A Travel Guide to the Middle Ages, The World Through Medieval Eyes. Our conversation on the ins and outs of medieval travel, how we learn about it, and some of the wild stories of journeys gone wrong is coming up right after this. Well, thank you so much, Anthony, for coming on and talking to me about medieval travel. It is such a pleasure to meet you. Welcome to the Medieval Podcast.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Well, it is my pleasure as well. I'm really excited about this book because I feel like people have tried to find different ways to get a lens on the Middle Ages and bring people into it, people who are not specialists in the community. And you've done this in a way that is different. There is already the time traveler's guide, but this is a traveler's guide to the Middle Ages. So what made you decide to use this lens to invite people into this world?
I can give you a very long answer to that question, but I'll try and keep it brief. I mean, really, it seems to me, I've been thinking about this topic and this project in different forms for many, many years. There wasn't a moment when I thought I'm going to write this book. It kind of coalesced out of various different interests and points in my background. But I think the two main influences, one is that I've been working for a long time on the travels of John Mandeville, one of the most popular medieval travel guides. And I've been thinking a lot about Mandeville's audiences and readers and people who traveled with a copy of Mandeville in their bag, and the legacy of Mandeville as a medieval writer and authority, and what Mandeville tells us about how medieval people encountered their world. So that was one thing. And working with Mandeville then helped me understand that it's in travel writing from the Middle Ages that we often see or hear individual voices, individual experiences, individual encounters that we don't often get in other kinds of medieval writing. So you may get things like confessions or at the occasional personal letter, but really you don't get much of a sense of individual subjectivity in lots of medieval texts. Whereas travel writing often talks, sometimes playfully, sometimes ironically, sometimes dishonestly, but does talk about this first-person voice and first-person experience of meeting other people, experiencing other places, of the curious or interested traveler making their way through the world. So I was very interested in that lens. So that's the kind of medieval origins of it. And then the modern origin of it, I suppose, is that the book was conceived and written and the research done for it during the COVID pandemic, when we were all in lockdown and our horizons had changed and our experience of travel had changed enormously, in ways that were unthinkable. And we'd gone from being this incredibly globally connected culture where business travel and leisure travel were so familiar to everybody in one way or another. And then suddenly people couldn't leave their houses or couldn't see their families and this kind of thing. So the nature of our experience of the world really changed. And we had to start thinking about our bodies, our individual boundaries, our individual certification as travelers in ways, again, which actually reminded me very much of how people in the Middle Ages experienced travel. And we had new obstacles put in the way of free movement. And so that was also very interesting to think about some of the continuities and discontinuities between medieval travel and the present day. And yet the book is really, the subtitle of the book, The World Through Medieval Eyes. My main source is medieval travel writing. It's sometimes they're travel guides, sometimes they're accounts of travels, usually travels that went pretty badly wrong. Very few people write a kind of, travel guide saying it was all fine, had a great time. That's the end. Most people write travel guides describing how bad it was and what you should be aware of and scared of. My sources are the travelers themselves. And so I'm able to then access some of that wisdom, some of that experience, some of that sense of what one needs to know, mainly in the 14th and 15th centuries, as something that cultural historians call travel culture starts to emerge. So not just accidental travel or enforced travel or things like migration or conscription, which cause people to travel, but actual an aesthetic kind of travel where people willingly travel, people know they are traveling, and an infrastructure exists to support travel.
Yes.
So that was a very long answer.
No. I asked the question and I was very interested in the answer, and it's given me a lot to dig my teeth into. So don't worry about that. I loved it. So yeah, I think this is really interesting because I think you're absolutely right. In the way that people write in the Middle Ages, you're supposed to suppress that personal, that I, you're supposed to leave it behind in the service of God, really, to make yourself disappear. There's so many anonymous writers that are writing in the Middle Ages. And with this, because it's so embodied, you can't leave yourself behind. And I think that's a really interesting distinction that I hadn't thought about before, about pulling that I to the front. You can't really not do that. And it's funny because that even happens when people are talking about something that they could not possibly have seen for themselves. So yeah, I do want to get into those travelers as people in a minute, but I do want to dig in for a second to this idea of travel as sort of a leisure pursuit or something where you're pursuing your curiosity or something. So can you tell us a little bit about the reasons why people traveled and where you're seeing this sort of change into the definition of travel that you're using right now?
Yeah, so I think, I would say that one definition of travel, which is partial, it's not a perfect definition, but travel as opposed to movement, is that travel is chosen at some level. So that might include travel like pilgrimage, probably the most common form of normal person's travel in the Middle Ages. But that also might include travel for things like diplomacy or travel for business purposes, merchants travel, which again becomes a very big sector in the later Middle Ages, a very organized sector. And then we also see really from the 14th century, yes, individual kinds of travels of curiosity, which might connect with travel for study, travel for monastic vocation, and pilgrimage increasingly shades into something like package tourism.
Yeah.
And it's where, we in English, we have this connection between the word holy day and holiday, which one is holy, the other one we now think of as unholy, and they kind of meet in pilgrimage. And lots of words connected to travel originate in pilgrimage, but really from the time of the Crusades, and particularly around the end of the Crusades, travel to Rome and Jerusalem and Santiago de Compostela starts to be organized definitely as holy travel, but through the agency of the Franciscans, and they operate as a kind of holy travel agency. And so, and I think it's not blasphemous to call that tourism, even though it often has a holy element to it, and often also has a kind of health-giving element to it. People take a pilgrimage for their own health or someone else's health. Often has a legal element to it. People can be forced to take a pilgrimage to atone for a sin or as a kind of tariffed penance. And people might take a pilgrimage on behalf of their community. Somebody might be sent on behalf of a group to undertake a pilgrimage. And so there's lots of different reasons why people are on the move. But really, I think there's a couple of different watershed moments, but one important one, I think, is in 1300 and then in 1350, there's the first two papal jubilees. And these are kind of festivals of pilgrimage where if you go to indulgence, full absolution of all your sins. And they really encourage people to, normal people, not rich people, to travel. And this becomes hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people are going to Rome for these events, and they become more and more frequent after 1350. And at the same time, the Custodia Terra Sancta is set up in the Holy Land by the Franciscans, operating out of Venice, but to move European pilgrims to the Holy Land and undertake guided tours. And so it becomes a much more organized commercial transaction. But at the same time, I think, the one thing I would qualify all that with is that most people traveled in the Middle Ages, even if that was only to your local well or your local saint shrine or to see your bishop. A kind of practical mobility was very normal. And I think people often misunderstand that. They think that people will just stay in their village, kind of looking after their pigs and playing on their bagpipes. And that is not what that's not true at all. People would go, we know that a lot of very normal people traveled really quite long distances to Canterbury, to Rome, to Jerusalem.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so my audio cut out for 1 second. Can you just go over one more time what an indulgence is for? So people are arriving in Rome, they're getting an indulgence. Can you just give me like a quick snippet of what an indulgence is for?
Really, I mean, this is also a very important issue, that one of the things which really accelerates travel is the culture of indulgences, which develops after the end of the 11th century and the First Crusade. And an indulgence basically grants that after death, your time in purgatory, after your body has died, your time in purgatory will be reduced or shortened, because sins that you've committed when you're alive will be indulged, pardoned, and remitted. So indulgences were usually associated with travel because they were connected to traveling to a saint's shrine. You got a certain tariff of indulgence if you went to a certain shrine. And in Rome, this became a kind of theme park of indulgences, a trail where you get different indulgences, different levels of indulgences. And in my book, I've got a little extract from one of the main Rome guidebooks from the 1450s, which says, for some places you get 100 years off your time in purgatory. Other places you get 7,000 years off your time in purgatory. Depends on the day you go there and the saint's shrine and what you do there. Some other places can deliver someone else's soul from purgatory if you go on a particular date. So it becomes a really well worked out, sophisticated idea of travel for the health of your soul. Even if your body really suffers during the journey, you're actually doing it for your future soul's health.
Yeah.
And so, it's the culture of indulgences, which very much drives religiously motivated travel at this time.
Yeah, I mean, it's especially good if your body suffers.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's more then you're suffering more like Christ and more like the saints, and you're renouncing the world. I mean, I think that's the idea of it. So, there's a theory of holy travel where you set your mind on the point of your pilgrimage and you just go straight there and you come back transformed. And if you die at your destination, that's even better. You've died closer to God. But there's actually we see that pilgrims start to differentiate around comfort, around modes of travel, around hostelries, around guidebooks, this kind of thing that a culture of consumption comes up around this, like it does wherever human beings with money gather. And there's more comfortable and less comfortable ways of traveling, like we have economy class and business class. And that starts to emerge. Even on a Venetian galley, there's a kind of top deck where you're away from the stinking bodies lying asleep in the bilge underneath the deck, which no one wants to sleep in, but normal people have to because that's all they can afford.
Yes, there are. I mean, maybe we should take a second and talk about this suffering, because this is why people love the Middle Ages, right? The gruesome stuff. But I mean, even the best hotels, they're supposed to change their sheets like once a month. So what are some of the things that you come across when you're traveling in the Middle Ages? Because I mean, reading this book, I never want to travel back to that time anyway, unless I'm in a bubble. But I mean, reading this book really reinforced it. So what are some of the challenges you have when you're traveling in the Middle Ages?
Wow, where do I start?
Yeah,
So
right?
I mean, the first thing is actually is the starting point is that most people, if they were undertaking a long journey for business or for religion or for any other reason, would actually assume that they weren't going to come back. They would assume that they might well die on their journey. And so they would settle their debts. They would get the permission of their prince or bishop. They would ask the permission of their husband or wife. They would make confession. And so they really would try and get their affairs in order so they weren't leaving any business in a bad shape. And then they would buy themselves all their luggage and the special, if they were a pilgrim, the special outfit of a pilgrim, which was a big hat, a cape, and a walking stick. And they would become, therefore, a traveler. They would take on the identity of a traveler. But I think the things that my sources really, that what they really talk about, they talk about the things that are kind of you'd expect, that you might be murdered or sexually assaulted en route, you might be attacked by bandits, but actually the thing that they're more worried about is their own bodies suffering due to what they call seasickness, but is I think something more like what we would call dysentery. They call it seasickness because it comes from partly from the motion of the waves, but also partly from dirty water and drinking dirty water, and terror at the sea as well, because people couldn't generally swim. And so seasickness and heat stroke, worries about poisoning, food, bad wine, dirty water, bad food, and hostile locals, particularly in the Holy Land. So people worry about their own personal safety and their own health an awful lot when they're setting out to travel. Things like bed bugs, fleas, being filthy, losing things, having things stolen, being ripped off on currency exchange. I mean, these all sound actually quite familiar, modern travel worries as well, not being able to understand the language. These are all concerns that we see in medieval sources, and they're very much about the personal comfort and discomfort of the traveler. I, like you, I'm not a medievalist, so I want to travel back there. I don't want to travel back there, but I do find sometimes these very, very moving points of connection where a traveler kind of discloses how uncomfortable and miserable they'd been at a particular point and how scared they'd been and how awful it'd been. And we've all had that moment of, of homesickness maybe, or of thinking, what am I doing here? Or this was such a terrible idea to come to this place, or I've lost my ticket, or I didn't get that visa, or whatever. And those are very across time, they connect, I think, in a really nice way with some of my sources.
Yeah, you have such sympathy. I have such sympathy, and I can tell that you do in this book as well, where you have that heart-stopping moment where something has gone so terribly wrong and you're not sure if you can fix it, and you might have to stay somewhere where you know nobody, you might not know the language, and it's all very sympathetic. And it's great when you have this coming out, as you say in the sources. There are many points in the book where you are reading something and you have brought out in your book moments where there is absolute terror or destitution, or you've lost all your stuff, and what are you going to do? It's extremely scary. It's not something that I want to do, for sure.
Can I tell you a little story about that, which is kind of connected to how I researched the book and goes back to your first question?
Of course.
One of my working methods, which I developed when I was working on Mandeville, was to try and travel to as many places that I was writing about as possible and do a kind of embodied research of thinking about senses, thinking about what would have been there at the time, thinking about this sense of encounter. But this was during the pandemic, so it was very difficult to travel, and all my travel went disastrously wrong in one way or another. And one of the most memorable, but also most difficult trips I made was to the Maldives. And I was on my way to India, and India closed its borders when I was in the Maldives. So then my trip to the Maldives was cut short, and I had to come back after 3 days, from London. It's a complicated story, but basically I couldn't leave the island I was on without a COVID test. And there was no one on the island to do the COVID test because it was a community of, 200 people. But my boat was leaving at 6 a.m. the next morning, and I stood on this jetty without the COVID test and waiting for this boat to come, not knowing if I'd be allowed on the boat, not knowing if I was going to be allowed to get away from the Maldives. And I looked on my phone, I saw the blue dot showing my location just in the middle of the Indian Ocean, really hundreds of miles from anywhere. And this was really very parallel to the experience of the person I was there to research, who was a 15th century Genoese traveler called Geronimo di Santa Stefano.
Mm.
And he undertook an epic journey to try and make money, to try and sell things, where he ended up in the Maldives for 6 months in the 1490s. And he waited for a boat to take him to India. And when he finally set sail, his boat fell apart after 8 days at sea, and he was left clinging to a plank overnight in the Indian Ocean by himself. And you just think this guy from Genoa, so literally out of his depth, so far from his own what's familiar, and then somehow a passing boat the next morning saves him, but he's still, somewhere he doesn't understand what's going on. Obviously, I didn't have the same experience, but I did have that similar feeling of the world is so unknowably large and chance is so mysterious. And then, anyway, I got back. I finally did manage to get on a plane from the Maldives, and I developed COVID on the plane on the way home. So that was a really not a good journey at all. It was probably one of the closest things to embodied research that we can do as medievalists, where we are measuring our sources and treading in their steps.
Yeah, but that is exactly why we don't want to do it.
Exactly.
Actually, that was one of my favorite moments in the book, because one of the beautiful things about this book is the way you can shrink the globe and then make it seem as its full size, depending on what we are looking at in the moment. And I have this deep terror of things that are underneath me in the ocean that I cannot see. And there is that moment where you have Geronimo's floating on this plank, and you have evoked all of these creatures that are just wandering around under the sea, living their own lives. And it really does give you a sense of scale as to how big this planet is.
Yeah. And I think that's a really nice thing about working on this material, is that we've got some people who devote their lives to staying in a monastery or making a repeated journey to a particular shrine. And then we have some of my sources who find their way all the way to, Java, Sumatra, the east of China, the Maldives, Africa. And I think that sense of, we perhaps have a sense that there's a whole world, and some people know more of it, some people know less of it. Whereas for my travelers, I think the very shape of the world, the horizons that they were seeking are very, very different. And that's something that was in flux in this period. And then, for travelers from the East and travelers from Islamic countries, they had totally different sense of horizons and a totally different sense of the shape of the world. So in the book, there's two world maps, one kind of mappa mundi and an Islamic map. And they're very different kinds of perspectives on the world. And that's true for all my sources. They have a different sense of where things are.
Where they are, and then who is there. One of the fun things I think that you have pulled out in this book is, no matter where you go, you find you're not the first person from where you are who's already there. There's almost always somebody who's already there. Even if you're writing and you're saying this is the first time we've ever been there, there's always some guy sitting at the pub with a pint, and they're from your area of the world already. And that was one of my favorite things about the book. But I mean, I need to ask you eventually, who are some of your favorite travelers? But one of mine was the man who was coming from Moscow and got completely lost, and then ended up just kind of interweaving his own life within the lives that he found himself within. So can you tell us a little bit about this man's journey?
Yeah, so this is Afanasy Nikitin, who is, even in Russian historical circles, is not hugely well known, even though it's an amazing source, a really wonderful source. And Nikitin was a mid-15th century merchant who originally set off to undertake just a commercial voyage. He was a merchant, and he went first to what's now Azerbaijan in Iran and kind of the area around what was Persia. And again, various misfortunes happened to him, as we see time and time again with the medieval travelers. And he ended up in central India and living in an Islamic sultanate. And he was there for at least 3 years. And his account of his journey starts off very much as a merchant trying to make a bit of money and survive on his wits. And he starts off very much with the curious eye of an outsider. He's interested in the food, the spices, the riches, the customs, how pretty the women are, where a merchant should stay the night, how much it costs to get a bed for a night. Quite a lot about sex tourism, things that you find in an outsider writing about a destination. But as his stay goes on, he describes how he starts to lose he forgets the Russian calendar, the Orthodox calendar. He forgets when the festivals are. He doesn't know what day of the week it is, doesn't know what time of the year it is. And he seems definitely to have partially first to have been forced to convert to Islam and then to have accepted his conversion to Islam, and also to have learnt several different languages, including a Turkic language, some Arabic, and some Persian. And it's actually an incredibly detailed but slightly disorderly source, his account of the journey. So it's not written down to tell you exactly what happened. It's an impressionistic source. That's what I'm trying to say. And he did try and make his way back to Russia and actually died on his way back. Once he got to Russia, he seems to have been killed quite near to getting back to his home. But he had written down a letter describing his experiences before he was killed. And that's how we know about his experiences. And it's really, he covers a lot of material about travel, but he also describes that sense of moving from unfamiliarity and strangeness to what we might now call going native. And that's, amazing to have a historical source of he's unusual, he's unique, but I'm not saying everyone in the Middle Ages had this experience. He's very much an unusual source, but it's a very, very compelling source and a very unusual window onto one man's experience.
Yes, because I think that especially people who come back, and many of these writers come back in a monastic sort of context, they're really reinforcing their identity as Christians who have gone out and have come back and have stayed Christian. And so this source really jumped out at me as being so different in that he opened himself up, I think, in a lot of ways, as you have gestured at, because he had to, because he had to eat the food and he had to start, celebrating the same religious rites as the people there in order to survive, and then became more part of the community. But it is so unusual to see someone being that vulnerable, like not leaning into, I never changed myself. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and I think that's absolutely right. And we do see in lots of the most common travel narrative of the Middle Ages is the trip to Jerusalem. Mm-hmm. And we do see there a lot of people being having their ideas temporarily disrupted. They think it's going to be like the place they've seen in their everyday religious culture, or that they've read about in the Bible, or what they've read about from Crusader chronicles, and they discover that it's an Islamic world. The weather's totally hostile, the locals are totally hostile, and places that they thought were going to be great cities like Jaffa are actually these tumble down ruins, and that they can't get good wine, they can't get good food. They have all these kind of practical problems which they just hadn't counted, and they thought it was going to be this kind of ascent to grace, and it actually turns out to be, an absolute ordeal. And then you do see quite a lot. I write about this, about people's accounts of landing at Jaffa, this kind of sense of, oh, wow, what have we done? What have we let ourselves in for? But then they correct that when they get to Jerusalem, and they kind of reinstate their lens, if you like, their perspective, and come back able to say, look, we could even survive that. So yes, I think that sense of culture shock, you get glimpses of it in Holy Land, but you get any of the travelers who go further, they tend to write about that much, much more. In China, in Persia, in the Far East, people will write much more about how they learned things which disrupted their sense of the normal.
Mm-hmm. And it was interesting how many of those really continued into really recent time. Like I'm thinking when I was growing up in the 80s, when you had an image of a far off place, it was all of the same tropes, like cannibalism or, this idea of some sort of strange marital norms where you might have like a harem or something like that. And I'm aware as I'm saying this of all of those really problematic ideas that are leading into this. But it's interesting how long those ideas lasted. That was one of the things that struck me about the book.
Yeah, and I think often the sources, medieval sources, were then actually confirmed by later travelers. Mandeville had a very long afterlife as a source. It was one of the texts that Columbus took with him on that famous journey in the 1490s. Yeah, lots of these sources inaugurate ways of looking that really would continue. And some of them actually, I think, still do continue to this day. And they're not necessarily uncomplicatedly the same, but they are definitely the roots of certain kinds of ethnography or anthropology that have persisted.
Absolutely. So I love when you can see a thread going back that far, even if it is something that, you have to wrestle with because it's just a problematic thing. It's interesting to see that going back. So do you have a favorite traveler that you necessarily want to travel with, like beside, or who you love to read? Do you have a favorite?
I mean, I guess one of my favorites is Felix Fabry. He was a friar born in Switzerland in the 1430s, and he was a Dominican friar for most of his adult life, and he traveled to the Holy Land in the 1480s. But he wrote a very, very garrulous, funny, sometimes ironic, sometimes kind of slightly, how do I say, histrionic and paranoid, but a very, very loquacious account of his travels there. And also, often in his account, he's very disarmingly honest about himself, about his failings, about his doubts, about his worries, and about his own personal status and about his physical appearance and about his, he talks about himself in a very open way. Mm-hmm. And I think he would have been not an easy person to travel with by any means, but would have been an entertaining person to travel with. I think probably as well, it would be remiss of me not to mention Marjorie Kemp, a very, very distinctive voice from medieval England who traveled to Jerusalem, to Rome, to Norway, to Poland, to Spain, and did a lot of that by herself or under her own steam. And she was famously a very difficult person to travel with because she describes herself how she was bullied by her companions for weeping at meal times, for talking about God all the time, for making sure she got her own way and getting her own route. But the reason I think she'd be a great person to travel with is she also had a real knack for kind of getting by and meeting that person from your town far away from home, or getting a free ride somewhere, or finding someone who would give her a hamper of food and wine each night for free. Mm-hmm. So she often managed to put herself in difficult circumstances, but then it all works out in the way. So she had that traveler's knack for relying on strangers. But I think, do individual personalities emerge? Definitely. Are they their true personalities? I think that's harder to know, because the travelers also are giving information which are for future travelers to find useful. So there's often a kind of screen over what they're saying, which slightly filters their own personality. The other person I should mention, who I really discovered during writing this book, was another German pilgrim, Konrad Grunenberg, who wrote not a very well-known story about his pilgrimage, also in the 1480s. And his journey is relatively uneventful, but he includes lots and lots of charming details and has an eye for, going to observe local customs. He goes to a kind of wedding in Dubrovnik to see how people in what's now Croatia get married. He talks about the wines and the food. And, he picks out lots and lots of nice little details which help you think about how he experienced a particular place in a very specific time. And because of the way he wrote his diary of his pilgrimage, you can actually say, on this day he went to this bakery and this is what he ate, and I really like that, because as medievalists we can't do that often with our sources. Maybe with a king or a prince we can do it, but with a regular, this guy was in charge of the city mint in the town of Constance in southern Germany. But he wasn't royalty. He was pretty well off. He was pretty educated, but he wasn't, from the top tier of society. But you get a sense of what his encounter with new places was. And I really like that.
Yes, yes. It's so concrete, which is really nice. And that makes it easier to trust it in some ways. And I'm using that word in like air quotes because can you really trust, well, anyone writing about their experiences, as you're saying, but especially medieval people who will say, I saw this, but it is something that is completely fabulous. So
Yeah.
before we go, can you tell us a little bit about why people would do that? Why they would sprinkle in this stuff about like Prester John, for example, in an account that is otherwise pretty concrete and pretty well tailored to how to travel?
That's a big question
Yeah.
about medieval aesthetics and medieval ideas of truth and what that phrase I saw or I heard or I was told, what these things actually mean. One of the things that appealed to me about writing this book and about my sources is that they do blend what we would call fact and fiction,
Hmm.
or they blend perhaps what we'd better call observed true encounters with things gleaned from books, things gleaned from other reports, things that they've been told in sermons or by other people. And there's not really a problem about that in medieval travel writing. I think to some extent that's because individual experience is not as highly valued in the Middle Ages as it is today.
Hmm.
And so that sovereignty of the individual perspective actually means more if it chimes with what other people have been saying for the last 600 years.
Yeah.
And it's hard to explain exactly what I mean, but we know that people who did go to Jerusalem and did see the Holy Land, some of them actually came back and they didn't write about what they saw. They copied out bits of Mandeville instead to describe what he had not seen 300 years earlier. And so, it's a bit like if we think about something like think about the 19th century and think about something from Dickens or Jane Austen. If somebody wrote a book about being bored and sitting in a dark room for a year in the time of Jane Austen, nobody would kind of have anything to do with Jane Austen. If somebody wrote a book about, kind of dances and gossip and love and country house romances in the time of Jane Austen, that would be much more like what we've come to expect. And that's also true for medieval texts. The world has a divinely authored shape, and everything in it in medieval Christendom is understood to be God's work, even the people who aren't Christians or the beasts that are in some way threatening or strange. And so travel writing has to give a full account of all of God's creation.
Yeah. So that makes me think about how it's in some ways serving the traveler in that just because you didn't see something doesn't mean it's not there, which is something that I hadn't thought about before this conversation. That just because you didn't get to see that giraffe on the safari doesn't mean that they don't exist. And so I could see why you'd want to throw those things in, even if it's something that you didn't see yourself.
Yeah, and if we think about how people, say from Western Europe, encountered other worlds, often they did find very surprising, shocking, remarkable, wonderful things there. Animals they had never met before, or customs they'd never experienced before, or riches of gold, or of fruit, or of spices. And so actually, new worlds, I don't mean just the new world as it was called, but any new world actually seemed to then confirm the wonders of travel writing rather than deny them. So, I think that's a really interesting way of thinking about a world which was full of potential and full of new worlds waiting to be encountered. And this is largely a pre-colonial world. Often the relationships that my travelers have with the worlds they encounter, they are about exploitation to some extent, about new markets, about new materials, about new luxury goods. But they're also about expanding the perspective of the traveler in ways that they've been led to believe were possible, right from kind of ancient Greek writing and ancient Latin writing, of kind of Pliny or of Herodotus, of worlds which are always kind of full of wonder and marvelousness and prodigies, and are always waiting there to be encountered.
Well, I love that. And I think that is sort of the perfect way to wrap this up, and imagining this entire planet, this world full of potential for people to see. And I'm hoping that this will inspire people to want to travel more. And if they can't travel, they can travel within the pages of the book, which is exactly what the medieval writers were encouraging as well. So thank you so much, Anthony, for coming on and talking to us about your travel guide to the Middle Ages.
Well, thank you so much. It's been really a great pleasure.
To find out more about Anthony's work, you can visit his faculty webpage at Birkbeck, University of London, or you can follow him on X at Real Mandeville. His new book is a travel guide to the Middle Ages, the world through medieval eyes, and it's available everywhere in hardcover and now just about everywhere in paperback. Before we go, here's Peter from medievalist.net to tell us what's on the website. What's going on, Peter?
Hey. Well, we have some sad news to start off. Elizabeth A.R. Brown passed away last week, and many historians, many medievalists who study France will know of her work. She's also very famous for publishing 50 years ago this year a groundbreaking article that was taking down the idea of feudalism.
Yeah.
So she's someone that many medievalists looked up to and admired.
Yes. And I am so grateful to her and her work, because it was some of the best work that I could find when I was researching Philip the Fair and France at that time when I was working on the Iron King. Her stuff was absolutely just spot on, just so well researched and thought out. She was a giant in our field.
Indeed. So you can read about her life and legacy on medievalist.net. Plus, we have a couple of our news pieces about the Battle of Hastings. There's a new theory on its location.
There's always a new theory on its location.
Indeed. There's one several miles to northwest where an apple tree was.
Right. The famous apple tree.
Yeah, so we have that. There's also some news about how it was very rainy that year in 1066 in England. And it would have had some impacts on the battle, in part because the land around Hastings was very marshy and the soil itself would have been almost waterlogged. I wonder how that made it for horses.
Exactly. You can't underestimate the impact of environment, climate, and actual weather on the day when it comes to military history. Well, this is a good opportunity to mention that you are talking all about the Battle of Hastings very soon for people who are interested in looking at the sources, right? Let's give a quick plug for your course, Peter.
Yeah. I'm doing the Battle of Hastings and the Norman Conquest. It's a self-paced course that we're doing through Thinkific. And it's basically me kind of telling you about the resources and sources, how you can start studying this battle yourself. I'm being a librarian here, and I hope people like it. We've had a lot of people already sign up for it, and it's going to get released on September 1st.
Yeah, so check that out and all the other courses at medievalstudies.thinkific.com, right?
That's right.
Okay, and what's the last thing you've got for us today?
Oh, we had a really fun piece called 50 Viking Age Saying, and this is collected from sagas. Norse people had their own ways of doing these expressions. A lot of them are pretty funny. My favorite one is someone who loses his gloves cannot be happy, even if he gets another pair.
Because they're his gloves. I totally understand that.
I really believe that. The Icelanders had good ideas.
It's true. And thank you for stopping by and telling us about those good ideas. People can find all that and more on medievalist.net.
Thanks.
This September, I'm back in the virtual classroom teaching my course on the very best century of the Middle Ages. It's called Calamity and Change, an Introduction to the 14th Century. It's 5 weeks long, and every week you get to spend an hour with me live on Zoom learning about what life was like in the 14th century, how people dealt with the many disasters, and what we can learn from them. For more information or to join us, please visit medievalstudies.thinkific.com. Class begins September 6th. Thank you to all of you out there supporting my work through letting the ads play through, recommending my podcasts and books to your friends, joining my online course, or joining medievalist.net's Patreon page. Patrons are my special heroes because it's your patronage that allows me to keep this podcast going, so thank you. If you'd like to become a patron, please visit patreon.com/medievalists. And check out medievalist.net's sweet new medieval merch at tpublic.com/stores/medievalistnet, where you can even get stuff with my super awesome logo on it. And if you do, take a picture and tag me so I can say thanks. For everything from travel to gravel, follow medievalist.net on Facebook or X at medievalists. You can find me, Danièle Cybulski, across social media at 5MIN Medievalist or 5 Minute Medievalist. And you can find my books at all your favorite bookstores, where you can get hold of Chivalry and Courtesy, Medieval Manners for a Modern World, now out in hardcover, ebook, and audiobook. Our music is Beyond the Warriors by Guy Frog. Thanks for listening, and have yourself a wonderful day.